And at this time, it is time for our last session. Is our movement ready to end anti-Blackness despite everything? The overrepresentation of white women and underrepresentation of Black leaders in prevention continues. Please turn your attention to our town hall moderator, NRCDV's Director of Racial Equity and Social Change, Jacqueline Miller, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Lalita. Michelle M. Osborne, JD, is an anti-racist facilitator and consultant with expertise in leadership development for both profit and not-for-profit organizations, racial equity and social justice practice, and the prevention of gender-based violence. A former prosecutor and trial lawyer, she focuses her expertise and years of experience on historic legacies of racism, the evolution of process, systems, policies, and cultures in institutions and organizations, and leadership development for women, girls, and femmes of color, and exploring the roles of women of color in positions of power and leadership. Michelle also conducts original research related to organizations' readiness to become more racially equitable. Michelle lives in Seattle with her husband and a very curious cat, and loves hearing her daughter's anecdotes about life at college. Will you join me in welcoming Michelle? Thank you.
Michelle, you are muted.
Hello, and thank you, Jacqueline, for that really kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm so honored and excited to be invited by NRCDV for this opportunity and to be in this really powerful space. I'm joining you from Seattle, Washington, and the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, who include the Tulalip, the Muckleshoot, the Snoqualmie, and the Puyallup, among many others. It also includes the land of the Duwamish and the Suquamish, the two nations led by Chief Seattle, for whom the city of Seattle is named. And I want to thank Tammy earlier today for the beautiful land acknowledgement, which has helped me to continue to understand why we must do recognitions of who walked and was stewards of the land then and now that we all live and work on. I also want to thank the ASL interpreters. I'm going to do my best to speak at a measured pace instead of my very usual fast speech. And I want to thank the Spanish language live translators and the wonderful translation that was done in Spanish on my slides. That I'm really appreciative of that. Despite the leadership that Black people have offered to freedom and anti-violence movements since the 17th century in this land, our question for today must be, why is the leadership of Black people so underrepresented in our movement? Thank you for forwarding and advancing my slides. So we'll look at the next slide. I just wanted to give you a little bit of who I am. I can tell you that I'm a Brooklyn, New York girl originally who was raised in Michigan, in East Lansing, home of Michigan State University, and in Detroit. I was also raised for a couple years as a child in Nigeria when it was on the eve of a civil war. And finally, I was raised in Seattle, Washington. I always, since a kid, was about equality and equity for girls and women. And especially because I was a child of sort of the tail end of what has now come to be known as the civil rights movement. So even in high school and college and law school, this was my concern. Where is the equity? Where's the equality, particularly for Black women and girls? But I formally found my way into this work in, I hate to say this, the 1980s. My first job out of law school was as a prosecutor in a very white Southern California county. So white that there were almost no Black lawyers in that county. There was one woman judge. She was not a woman of color. There were about 8 women in the district attorney's office that I landed in. And I was one of those 8 women, but I was the only Black attorney in the entire office for 2 years. You can imagine that a woman in a situation like that might ask a lot of questions, and I did. I asked questions about the white normative male view of criminal justice. I was against the death penalty. I talked about including Black and brown people on juries, which was rarely done at that time. I questioned the level of justice that was meted out depending on income and race. And yes, I was punished for that. My punishment was to be sent to the sex crimes unit, which is what I think it's still called in a lot of DA's offices. And I didn't think that was punishment at all, but it was seen as punishment because if you wanted to get ahead in the office, you wanted to do robbery, major crime, homicide, death penalty cases. Well, I didn't want to do those. And what I found in the sex crimes unit was that it wasn't punishment for me. It was an opportunity to help survivors, women and children and men who had been ignored largely by the criminal justice process and DAs within our office because they felt that those were not important crimes. They wouldn't advance them in the office. So I knew something about the dynamics of sexual assault and domestic violence, but I learned so much more about the needs of survivors, whom we called, of course, victims. And I really learned at that time that what I needed to do was be part of other social justice movements that were supporting the thriving and survival of these types of folks who I was seeing on the other side of the ledger in the court. Even after I left the DA's office, I continued to volunteer with different social service organizations that worked with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. When I finally stopped practicing law, stopped being a civil trial attorney, I continued to work in these organizations. I eventually worked for a multi-community outreach project for a large domestic violence agency in the San Francisco East Bay area. The agency was wondering why women and survivors of color weren't using their services. And so I was given that opportunity with a small staff to explore that and to come up with answers and recommendations. And it meant doing focus groups and talking to people in the communities that were not being appropriately served. So that was a great lesson in hearing and listening and knowing that the wisdom for how to be served better resided within the communities themselves, not with us at our agency over here going, oh, we think we know what they need. I just want to do a quick shout out to David Lee, who was my colleague at that agency. He did other work at that agency at that time, but it's always nice to see people that you've worked with over the years. I also ran a rape crisis center in Silicon Valley and continued to work with other women of color who were doing this work to ask the really tough questions about why is there so much racism in our work? Why aren't we being recognized for not only our leadership, but the ideas and vision that we're bringing to this work? And y'all, all that stuff was happening for me before the year 2000. That's how long I've not only been doing the work, but also how long these questions have been going on. So I think that what's really important about today is that we continue to look at how long we've been asking these questions of inequity and equity and leadership by Black and brown women and people in this movement. And why has it not shifted the leadership, the visions enough in our movement? So I want to, as we look at the next slide, have us really think about thoughts for today. And I want to put some language and concepts in your heads that you've already been hearing over the last 2 days, but really ask you to have it resonate in your reflection on these questions. These ideas, these concepts include the challenging things that you're going to be hearing, some of which may be upsetting. I recognize that, particularly for Black folks and folks of color today, but it's also that part where if we can't talk about it and see it, then we continue to ignore it and render it invisible to us. So I want these terms and concepts to be in your thoughts today. Pro-Black, pro-Blackness. Black women and Black people have always been leaders in this work for centuries. Learn who they are. Their legacy is what we continue to build on today and will in the future. Trust Black women, trust Black people. We have been showing you the way for centuries in anti-violence. And on the issue of social justice and practice, we haven't been wrong. Alignment of the values of our movement with the so-called values within your agencies and organizations. As Tara Peterson spoke about just a few minutes ago, many of those values have been created by Black women and Black people and people of color in our movement. Center Black and brown people's lived experience, decenter white people's narratives, decenter the major white narrative of how we got here and how we do our work. Shift and change that narrative to include what Black and brown people have been giving us, this movement, for centuries. Intersectionality, seeing and understanding it will take you to the door of solutions. Open communication, transparency, accountability, being allied in being an accomplice. Take risks, meet the challenges that anti-racism gives us. Did I say listen to and believe Black people and people of color? In our movement, we believe women. In our movement, we do not yet believe Black women, Black people, and people of color. Elevate Black leadership. Did I say anti-racism? I can't say it enough. But use your power to shift power. I want to take a moment here. A lot of white organizations say, we don't have any power. We're at the mercy of our fundings and these rules and regulations that we have to meet and what our community will tolerate or won't tolerate with respect to diversity and racial equity. You have power. You're running a powerful organization. Step into it. Don't allow your funders to tell you how powerful you can be. Have power, use it for good. Be fearless and never ignore the power of self-care and healing. Racism is trauma. It is trauma to Black people. It is trauma to brown people, to non-white people, but it is also trauma to white people. Everyone must heal. Everyone must take self-care. Don't ignore it. So those are some thoughts, some concepts I want you to reflect on as we go on today. Let's look at the next slide where I want to offer you an additional definition to racism that you may already be using, but I want you to think about this expanded way of looking at power when we talk about racism and the power embedded within white supremacy that continues to control racist institutions, systems, and structures in our society. This is Professor Ibram X. Kendi. You may know him from his books, Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racism in the United States. Also, his most famous works relate to how to be an anti-racist. And here's what he tells us about really deepening our view into power within racism and racist institutions, systems, and structures in our society. He says, racism is the marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalize racial inequity. And what's a racist policy? It's any measure that produces or sustains inequity between racial groups. What's a racist idea? It's any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another group in any way. What I love about this definition is that he really names what power looks like. He also gives us a direction as to how we eliminate racist policies and ideas. He says, institute anti-racist policies and anti-racist ideas. I'm not saying it's simple, but that is a map forward that we're not often given. Change out the racism, change out the ideas, put in anti-racism. The other thing that he's saying is that stop this stuff about not being racist, stop this stuff about I'm neutral on the subject of race, stop this stuff about I'm a good person, I would never be racist, I've never owned a slave, I've never used the N-word, I have Black friends, blah, blah, blah. He says that's not really what's going on here. We're not looking to see who's good and who isn't, because good white people have stood by, not understood, and therefore harm continues. So this isn't about, are you a good white person? This is about, have you done in the moment a racist thing, said a racist thing, advocated for, been complicit in a racist policy or idea? And what this suggests is that we cannot be in that moment. We cannot, therefore, perpetuate it. We can actually interrupt it. We can stop it. We can eliminate it by being anti-racist. And he also suggests to us that because of inferiority, that is another legacy of white supremacy and racism, people of color are also swept up in perpetuating white supremacy, and we can stop it as well in those moments where we begin to feel ourselves being drawn into complicity. He says, be anti-racist in your actions, in your words, in your advocacy. I find what he's offering us very powerful, constructive, productive. So let's look at the next slide now that we have some help in thinking about, okay, what can I do? Well, let's remember how racism is deeply embedded in our movement to end gender violence. We've got to be clear about this. We can't pretend that we don't know or that we don't understand. If we're still at the, well, I'm kind of aware, then we need to get very quickly beyond that awareness into accountability so that we can be advocates and we can take action. What's the first thing we got to know? There's a historic legacy in our country: patriarchy, misogyny, racism, including anti-Blackness. Now remember, even within our own movement, there's misogyny, there's patriarchy. How can I help you understand that? Every time a funder says, take money under this condition, and that condition doesn't sit right with you, but you take the money, there's some patriarchy and misogyny going on. We're being told as women, who primarily women who run these types of anti-gender movements with the agencies and organizations that support it, we're being told what can be tolerated, what can't. And yes, thank you for that. It's not just misogyny, it's misogynoir. I appreciate you, Kim, for uplifting. That is another element of misogyny. Misogynoir, of course, is misogyny directed in particular against Black women and Black people. Let's look at the second thing. Virtually every institution, system, or structure in our country was first and foremost designed only to benefit and advantage white people, including white women. I ask you to think about law enforcement as an easy way to examine this. In law enforcement, of course, law enforcement was not designed to protect or benefit Native American and Indigenous people or enslaved Black people, right? What came out of the early iterations of law enforcement, like the Night Watch or the slave patrollers, then began to become in law enforcement. But at no time was that designed to protect Black people. I mean, if you're running a centuries-old enslavement scheme, why would you ever protect through law enforcement the Black people, the Black bodies that you're enslaving? So remember, every institution in this country, education, medicine, healthcare, transportation, incarceration and imprisonment, we can go on and on. We're not designed for Black and brown people. We just happen to kind of also sort of maybe benefit. Let's not forget that. The third thing is that for centuries, white people have been socialized consciously and unconsciously to view Black people as a problematic group of people, including problematic Black women and girls. You guys, I'm not even going to say any more about this because you know it's true. Let's stop denying this. Black people are seen as some sort of problem that has never quite been fully resolved. even in our movement. Can I mention shelters that never seem to keep Black women and children very long, right? I mean, the studies have shown over and over again, and I'm not going to even quote it here, that on average, Black women and children stay in emergency shelters less time than white women and children. And we know why. Let's go to 4. In general, white people do not consider that they have any accountability for the racial discrimination, oppression, and even violence that Black people are faced with every day. And if you don't believe that, think about how remorseful and reflective white people felt after George Floyd's murder. Lasted for a few months, a lot of, introspection seemed to be happening, but really we're now back at that idea of, I don't have any responsibility for that as a white person. Why can't that community become more responsible and accountable to itself? And then, we could respect that community more. So that dialogue happens in our heads because of socialization, even if we're not aware that it's happening. Let's look at the next slide because I want to give you a couple more things that we have to know and understand to accept what's going on in our movement. White people, including white women, are socialized to minimize, ignore, discredit, undermine, forget, render invisible, or view as insignificant the contributions and achievements of Black people, particularly Black women. That's a socialization thing. And even in our movement, we've known better for decades, and we still kind of forget. When I talk about some of the Black women and women of color that I remember as leaders in this movement, including going back centuries, sometimes white people don't know what I'm talking about. They have never heard. They're excited to learn, but they don't know who I'm talking about. I'm thinking, because Black women, Black people, and other people of color, we remember, we know. Why is that? Let's look at number 6. White people, including white women, are socialized consciously and unconsciously to believe that Black people, particularly Black women, are never quite ready for leadership roles. It was so powerful to hear Tara and Zoe's stories in particular this morning, Valeriana and Darren's stories about how they moved forward in this movement yesterday morning. Also, we had another panel that included women of color. Yesterday, I remember Tammy, Claire, Jennifer, Elise were part of that panel who also talked about their experiences. It was heartening to hear Tara say that at one point she was told, you need to apply for this position of leadership. I and a group of us are going to support you. And, if you don't get it, you need to plan a strategy for walking away and going on to where you will be appreciated with your leadership and vision. That is so powerful and does not often happen for us in this movement. Let's look at 7. Despite the many reports, surveys, troubling events, and Black voices lifted against the status quo, the predominantly white leadership of our movement has failed to see or include Black leadership. Just want to make that clear. We're here and yet we're invisible. We've been erased. We're not remembered. Or worse, our stuff is taken because it's so good and not acknowledged or credited. So let's look at the next slide. And thank you for the reminder to slow my voice a little. This slide represents a powerful article, not yet 6 months old, that was published in March of this year online by Mother Jones magazine. This article represents a major shift in our knowledge and awareness of racism in our movement, and also misogynoir. And this cannot be ignored. This is required reading. This is book club material. Every staff and board member of organizations in our movement should read it. But it is painful reading. It is dense and complex and nuanced. There is much to be thinking about, reflecting on. There are many revelations here. You should have many epiphanies as you read it. This article tells dramatic truths that each of us will recognize, no matter who we are. It's not linear. In this article, we can see the wrongs done and also some of the answers that are needed. But is this article being read by people in our movement? There are only 3 comments the last time I looked, 3 comments accompanying this article. So what I want to say is that even after this article came out, and I admit that I'm quoted in the article, so are a lot of other people who are Black and people of color in this movement. But I worked with a sexual assault services agency client after the article came out this year. And the director kept telling me, I know about the article. I need to find the time to have my leadership team and staff not only read it, but then schedule a time for us to discuss it as an organization. I encouraged her numerous times to say, yes, you need to do that. To date, that organization has not found the time. So that's what's at stake. The article is telling truths that are harmful. They're about continuing harm, about perpetuating harm, about what it looks like up close and personal. It's almost a manual for, how can we have racism within our organization and pretend that we're not? And yet, this is not getting the attention it deserves. So I commend all of you. This is your homework that I'm giving you. No, I will not check up on you, but particularly white leadership, including your boards, you must read this. You must learn from it. And if you need some guides on it, there are people who are willing to help you, and you will, of course, compensate them for the time and labor that they'll put into this. But this is key. There's much here that is about the problem in our movement. So let's look at the next slide. I'm quoted in the article as saying this, which I've been saying for years. Everybody loves to quote Audre Lorde, but somehow nobody wants an Audre Lorde to be their executive director. Now, when I say that, I think you guys know what I mean. Audre Lorde gave us so many directions and of brilliance and vision to follow in our movement. Audre Lorde is one of the mothers of our movement, the founding mothers with her wisdom, gone too soon. And you know, other people that are always being quoted by our movement, Black people, Black women in particular, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, June Jordan, Kimberly Crenshaw, Maya Angelou, Beth Ritchie. There are even more, and I'm embarrassed that I'm not going to name all of them. But what I'm also embarrassed about is that our movement takes the wisdom of these incredible Black women. And let me not leave out that there are other women of color who are also saying brilliant things, visions, and directions for us to move in. We quote them, but we don't actually want anybody who's living up to what they're saying and implementing it. Black women, Black people, as leaders in our organizations. So Audre Lorde becomes a poster on the wall, but a woman or Black person like an Audre Lorde is not leading our organizations, except in the rarest of situations. Shout out again to all the Black sisters who are leading organizations and coalitions in this country. So I want to say that you can't have posters of Black people on your wall. You can't quote them and then ignore the Black people in your midst who are implementing these ideas, these visions, and have others of their own. You can't do that and think that you're doing the work. So let's look at an example of when there was this belief that the work was being done. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is very powerful. It's called the Moment of Truth letter, literally. And when I saw this letter, I was like, okay, there's some amazing things being said within this letter. This letter was signed by 47 sexual assault and domestic violence state coalitions not long after George Floyd was murdered, state government sanctioned murder by a Minneapolis police officer. at the end of May 2020. And this letter said something amazing right there in that paragraph that I've bolded. We, the undersigned sexual assault and domestic violence state coalitions, call ourselves to account for the ways in which this movement, and particularly the white leadership within this movement, has repeatedly failed Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, survivors, leaders, organizations, and movements. This is powerful stuff, folks. I know that some of you have never seen this letter. I can tell you that it's part of the resources that Town Hall NRCDV is offering. It's also, I believe, on VAWnet, I'm saying it wrong, VAW.net. And if anybody can correct me on that, you can put that in chat and I'm going to appreciate you for it. But this letter actually says something that we have not heard the movement at this level say before. Or anyway, that's what was said in June 2020. Okay, I did a little research. I did a random search of some of the coalitions that signed on to this letter, their websites, to see if they have this letter posted, to see if they have any accountability statements that they've made that shows how they are implementing the issues that they confronted for themselves in this letter. And you know what, you guys? I know it was random. I didn't look at all 47, but what I found in the ones that I did look at, the letter's not there. There's not a mention of it. There's no accountability statement that says, in the years since 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, when we said we would understand and do better. No, there's nothing like that, just on the websites that I went to. So let's talk about this performative letter and its problematic issue. Number one is that if you read the letter in full, and I've just quoted the first couple paragraphs, you will see that there's not really a statement of what each coalition that signed the letter is planning to do. There's a lot of recognition, a lot of statement of awareness, and I will not put that down. This is still a milestone in our movement. We will never be able to ignore this letter again. It will always be present. Just like the murder of George Floyd, just like January 6th, there's a before and there's an after, and that's where we are. We're in the after, but the after is about accountability. What's going on here, right? So what I say to you is you can't do performative letters and raise awareness, but also obscure what you will do to account for the harm that you have done and to talk about how you will never let that happen again. And because the letter is the way in which our movement talks about harm, we've acknowledged it. When I say we, I mean everybody, but I'm really talking about white leadership, acknowledges it at times, but then does nothing. So I've already, in what I've said to you, suggested to you that this letter is both important, significant, but problematic and performative. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what that offers. The next slide is again from Professor Kendi's research, and he says, you know what, we need some help in thinking about how people get talked about in the world of racism. Racism asks, what's wrong with that person of color? What's wrong with those loud Black women in our emergency shelters and their out of control kids, or whatever has been being said in our movement for decades since we started emergency shelters and started admitting Black women and their children? Why do we go there with that racial stereotyping? So when we say what's wrong with a person of color, we're also saying what's wrong with a racial group, as if we are a problem. But anti-racism asks the real and correct questions. What's wrong with policies that allow racist ideas and procedures and process to be instituted against Black people and people of color? What's wrong with conditions? What's wrong with systems? What's wrong with structures that allow us to produce and normalize racial inequity, violence, harm. So if your agency is still asking about, let's do our client review this morning. Guys, I got a client in shelter who's a problem, blah, blah, blah. And those of us sitting around that table know instantly that that client is a person of color just from the way they're being talked about, then that is racism. Instead of saying, we have a client in shelter where I don't think our policies, our process are working to maximize that person's ability to not only survive what's going on right now, but to thrive when they leave our shelter. That's the way we should be talking. And Professor Kendi helps us. But you know what? We need some more help. So let's go to the next slide. I just want to give us all a brief reminder of how today's inequities in the context of history led us here. And I've given you some thoughts about how we've treated each of the major racial communities in our country, how we've treated Native and Indigenous women and girls and people, how we've treated African American girls and women, what we have done to women from Latinx communities, what we do to LGBTQIA communities, folks from those communities in our movement. And finally, how in the modern women's movement, we have ignored much of the leadership and vision that has been offered. So I want to talk about that a little bit more. And I also want to have the Spanish translation of this slide come up in just a moment. Thank you. So what is important about this is that if we don't understand the history of what's gone on and is going on in our movement, how the people that we want to serve best but serve poorly got to us, we have to understand the history of our country. And it's really that simple. If we're going to have awareness and understanding 101, this is like the second day, because the first day is Professor Kendi and helping us understand racism, So then the second day is let's talk about history, and let's talk about that history still being in the movement. It has not gone anywhere. How can we have the movements by our Native American and Indigenous sisters for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, not just in the United States, but in Canada? And we're seeing other countries really continuing to adopt the wisdom and brilliance and leadership from those movements, countries like Australia, countries like Mexico, etc., adopting what we're learning from those movements. But why are we having these movements at all? Why weren't we already working with Native and Indigenous communities to be protective of women and girls in particular in those communities? Because we've known for centuries what we have done in those communities. So with enslavement, did we really think that it ended at the end of the Civil War? Because we've always known it hasn't. If we look at Ida B. Wells' leadership on anti-lynching during the Jim Crow and segregation eras, if we look at the work that Rosa Parks originally was doing as a field secretary for the NAACP, she was working with rape survivors, Black women being raped by white men as they had been, vulnerable to that type of sexualized violence since the beginning of enslavement. If we listen to Fannie Lou Hamer and her talk about the abuse visited on Black women's bodies when they were simply trying to get some simple health care, walked in for an appendectomy, left with a hysterectomy. And we know that that is still happening to women of color. We knew it as recently as 2021 when we heard tales from women who are incarcerated for immigration issues. We know this exists, and yet we've closed an eye to it. We know what our sisters and brothers in the LGBTQIA communities are experiencing, and yet within our movement, we're still having issues about how do we address that. So I just want to make clear that we know our history and we don't know our history. And we can't not know anymore. We cannot not know. It doesn't work like that to say that we're going to solve racism without knowing how we got here, without understanding our socialization of erasure and invisibility for communities furthest away from justice, communities who are most oppressed, and communities that we don't always know how to serve. Remember that as early as the 1980s, we were having organizations develop in our movement that were to serve women and children from oppressed communities because they could not be served effectively in our white-led organizations. I want to think about the Asian Women's Shelter. Shout out to Becky Masaki's early leadership there. I want to think about the coalitions and research groups of Black women that developed around this work. And again, the 1980s and 90s, because we knew that folks from our communities were not being properly served by white-led organizations. And those types of organizations exist to this day. But you know, I live in a state, as many of us do, where the Black population is small, and the ability to start a Black women's shelter and sexual violence organization, for instance, is very difficult. So for the most part, we're going to be relying for services which are paid by our tax monies in many instances that have white leadership, right? That's just a reality of life. But why does it have to be white leadership? As I've been saying, we know that we've got leadership of color. We've always had it. Why are we not allowing that leadership to flower and grow? So let's look at the next slide. This is a question. Why is a white dominant leadership structure still the rule in our movement? As I said, these questions have been asked for hundreds of years. I'm going to prove it to you in just a moment. But I've been involved in these conversations for decades as well with others in the movement. You know, I've seen or worked in organizations where the executive director or senior leadership position, which was white, was about to be vacated. And rather than the position being posted, the next thing I know is that it's just turned over to another white person. The latest example of me seeing that was in 2021. So that idea that I think was mentioned earlier in Tara and Zoe's talk about we're just going to shift to who we know and who we trust. We're not going to open it up to others. We're not going to see the possibility of others is still within our movement. It's a way in which white dominant leadership gets passed along to another white person. You know, in that Mother Jones article that is required reading for all of us, a group of organizations, sexual assault organizations led by executive directors and their CEOs signed a letter in Washington State challenging a Black ED of the statewide sexual assault coalition just months into her tenure. Some of the people who signed that letter were people of color. Why was that letter even written? The Black ED was supremely qualified, hired by her board as qualified, and she was a co-ED with a white woman. So why did they write this letter? You know, there's no honeymoon for women of color, Black women, Black people who take leadership, right? I've seen it in my own practice of law. I've seen it in a lot of organizations. There is no honeymoon. That's right. So there's no grace period at all. You don't, if you're trying to understand how that works, let me remind you that President Obama was challenged by birtherism. This man was one of the most qualified candidates for the presidency of the United States ever. At the very least, he had the same qualifications as a lot of other people who had become president or run for president, right? And yet he was challenged in every single way. Think Kamala Harris in 2020, also challenged as not being an American citizen, even though she was born in Oakland, California. This idea of despite our experience, our qualifications, our past proven leadership. President Obama was a senator. Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of California. Our leadership is called into question. Instead, we're comfortable with what we know when we pass on leadership. Think on that for a moment. And by the way, go back to that moment of truth letter. As I was saying in my little research, 2 years after the letter was affirmed by so many coalitions, some of those coalitions are still virtually all white in their staff, and they're all white on their boards. How could that be? Let's look at the next slide. We have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She was a free-born African-American woman before the Civil War, who was an advocate for civil rights, particularly for Black women's issues on the subject of voting as well. She was this Black suffragette. She had an 1866 speech, "We are all bound up together," and she called out white women as not supporting Black women's need to also receive the vote. If you've studied the suffragette movement in this country, you know that some famous white people that we venerate as leading suffragettes actually didn't want Black men to get the vote, and they didn't want Black women to get the vote at a time when Black people didn't have the vote. So as early as 1866, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper says, "I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America." She was talking about, look, you guys should be our natural allies. We all want the same thing. But you are betraying Black people, and in particular Black women, on this issue of the vote and related issues of civil justice. Why y'all doing that? And she was very clear that she had received promises of support and then they were taken away, that there was invisibility to Black women wanting the vote, the invisibility created by white women saying they're not ready for it. So I just want to say that this issue within our movement of white women not sharing power, not advocating for, not standing beside, is centuries old. And you know that even before it was happening to Black women and Black people, it was happening to Native American and Indigenous people as well. So when I talked about the history and the legacy, let's not forget how far back it goes. We got to root it out. So let's look at the next slide. What does accountability to Black people look like in your organization? Now, only you can answer that because you know your organization, but let me throw some ideas and questions at you. What's accountability look like? Because so many organizations haven't figured it out, this is endemic to all of our organizations in our movement. Why hasn't accountability been built into the work that the organization does? Because we've been telling you about this for, and I again say centuries. Why the resistance? Black clients and people of color, how are you really serving them? And do you know how to serve them? I told you about a multi-community outreach project that I did. It was very instructive as communities of color told us why they didn't use our agency services or were hesitant to use them or only use them sporadically in certain ways because they could not otherwise feel that they would be held to getting the services that white people got. So there was an accountability issue to communities of color. What about the accountability issues to Black staff and people of color? Are you overburdening them with that diversity thing? Here, you take care of that for us. What about Black board members and POC members? I've heard horrible stories about what happens to Black folks or people of color who join boards in our organizations and how they get marginalized, or as was mentioned earlier today, get sent off to do the sort of diversity and equity stuff. How do you listen to the communities? Is it one of those things where I worked for an organization that said, oh, we know what the community is going to say. They're always saying the same thing. We already know. Really? If you already know, why aren't you doing what they've talked about needing? And if you already know, are you updating it by continuing to listen, or have you shut them off and silenced them? What does accountability look like? Let's look at the next slide. What is your organization doing to shift power from white to Black leadership? Wow, is this a painful issue? So we heard some things about mentoring and coaching and supporting and letting there be a honeymoon like white people get when they move into new roles, letting there be a grace period. But what really happens a lot of times instead is that, again, white leadership is saying, well, we hired this person, but we're expecting everything from them. And a lot of it is unarticulated expectations, which is, we know, is dangerous. And the other thing that happens is that we know the disproportionality and disparities that are happening within our organizations for staff or the people that we serve. And yet we want the new person of color, Black leadership to come in and fix everything. And if they don't, we hold the existence of these longstanding disproportionalities, disparities, harm against them. So even as we talk about what are you doing to shift power, I'm not going to answer that question for you so much as, again, try to lead you to answers by saying to you, tokenism is not the answer. You can't install a Black leader or a leader of color and give them complete whiteness surrounding them. You can't do that and think that they're going to be successful, which leads us to sink or swim is not the answer. You get in place, you either sink or swim in leading this organization. Well, that's not a best practice in any environment, and it's not a socially or racially equitable best practice or method. Support, resources, mentoring, coaching, actually going on the search to find capable and fantastic leadership, and then supporting and resourcing them and standing up for them. Again, in the Mother Jones article, we saw that when that letter signed by members of the coalition went out against the new Black co-executive director, the board did not stand up and defend her. The board was radio silent. The board was missing in action. You can't do that, and we know that. Let me ask you another question. What are actionable strategies for shifting power? I'll ask you some more questions and see if this will help. Have you identified policies which created the inequities in your organization, in the communities that you serve? Have you identified ideas in your organization that normalized or made it okay for these inequities, disproportionate service, disparities in service to exist? Have you identified the historical context of the ideas? Do you know the racist history of the community, region, state in which your organization is located? Do you know it? Because the Black people and people of color sure do. You better catch up, right? Suddenly, white people learned about Tulsa, the horrific history of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Black people are like, white people are like, I didn't know that. Oh my God. Black people are like, particularly Black people from Oklahoma, are like, we knew that. We've known that. We've been living with that. So that idea that some people know the history and others don't, that needs to end. In Seattle, recent example, Seattle Children's Hospital, terrible racial inequities were going on. When it was finally brought to the forefront by a beloved Black doctor, white people are going, what? That's happening at Children's, but it's a premier hospital. How could that be? And Children's is still doing the work to understand its own history. Is that happening in your organization? Have you admitted to and named past harms? Remember the Moment of Truth letter, it started to name the harms, but each of those organizations that are a part of the coalitions that signed the letter have to do that individual work. Have you created a statement of goals, strategies, tactics, and accountability and transparency on how you're going to repair the harm, increase racial equity, and be anti-racist? Those are just a couple of the things that I'm going to, ask you to think about. I actually have a 20-point program for beginning this type of work. And Zoe remembers that I shared some of that with her recently. But everyone needs to ask this question: how do we shift power from white to Black leadership? And don't get me wrong, I am also including people of color leadership, but specifically anti-Blackness is so profound in our movement that I focus on that. Let's get to the end of this so that I can answer a couple questions if possible. Let's look at the next slide. Just a reminder that, the actual strategies for shifting power. We're going to move to the slide beyond that. In the next slide, I'm just reminding us that Dr. Kendi says that we must be anti-racist. That is the way this is going to end. It's a transformative concept. It re-energizes our conversation. It gives us a place to move to. We're not just stuck in awareness about racism. We're now in accountability, advocacy, and action in anti-racism. Let's look at the next slide. This is, when will racism disappear? A question once asked of Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, and she was just upfront. When it's no longer profitable, when it's no longer psychologically useful. When that happens, it'll be gone. In our movement to end gender violence, we need to get here yesterday. We don't have any more time. Yes, people are dying, and we know that. So what are we waiting for? Last thing I'm going to do, and then I hope we'll have questions. And Renee, thank you so much for giving me a little bit of your time, but I don't want to take it all if we can avoid it. And what that is an activity, because I want you guys to have a little bit of hope in thinking about it. This is the waterfall activity. We'll look at the next slide to see how this works. I love her, because we know what this means, even for those of us who really don't speak Spanish very well, right? So let's continue to think about that. Without women, without Black women, without Afro-Latino women, without women of color, without people who stand with women of color, there's just not going to be the revolution that we need in our movement. So we'll go to this exercise that I'm calling an exercise that reminds us of power that we have. I keep saying we're going to the exercise, and I forgot that I gave us some inspirational quotes. This one is from Adrienne Marie Brown. She made this quote even before COVID started, and that's what I love about it, because it's evergreen. It is always with us, this idea that we have energy and can give our power to our whole selves to shape our future. So thank you for that wisdom, Adrienne Marie Brown, another person who's always getting quoted in our movement. Wouldn't we like her to lead some of our organizations? I know I would. I'll try it one more time and see. Oh, this is the question and comments. So let's do that. Before we do any exercise, are there any questions I can try to answer in just the few moments I have left? I don't know if there are questions in the chat or if someone would like to unmute and ask a question, but I know we have time for one or two.
Thank
Michelle,
you,
we haven't gotten any questions in the chat yet, but if folks want to share questions, please, please, please feel free. Or yeah, like Michelle said, you can come off mute and ask verbally.
Thank you. While we're waiting for questions, we'll do the exercise. Even though you guys may never see the slide, I'm gonna Oh, do we really have that much time? Oh my gosh, thank you.
Michelle, I'm not seeing the waterfall slide here. Let me see if I can pull it up on my screen. Give me just a moment.
Thank you. And even if we don't have it, it's fine, because I'll just tell people what the instructions and then we can do it together. But it looks like I have a little extra time. And so I'm always happy to see what I can do to answer questions or even take comments. So while we wait to see if there are any, and maybe there aren't, and that's fine, because everybody I know is really reflective about what we've been hearing and learning these last 2 days. So that is really what I hope I have added to with this work. But here is what I think we can do as a hopeful exercise, and this is honoring leadership by women of color. So here's the thing. Think about a woman of color who inspires you. Place your answer in the chat box, but do not yet press send, because what we're going to do is waterfall. After people have placed answers in chat box, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, waterfall. Then you're going to press send, and we're going to have a cascade of brilliant Black and people of color leadership in chat that we can work with, that we can think about, that we can reflect on, and that we can see as iconic for the vision, brilliance, and direction in which we need to go in our community. Yes, they can be people we know personally, because some of this work is being done in our communities, and we need to shout out to that leadership in our communities. I have a friend who passed away nearly 20 years ago, a brilliant leader, Puerto Rican woman who was leading both in San Francisco and back in her hometown of Brooklyn, another Brooklyn girl, and I want to put her name into chat. So I'm talking about women of color, people of color, Black women, Black folks of color who have inspired you as you do this work. Everybody putting a name into the box, into the chat box. I'll give you a couple more seconds, and then I'll say the magic waterfall word, and then all at once you'll click send, and you guys will be able to look at each other's responses. Let's take another 15 seconds before I say the magic word. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I'm getting ready to say the magic phrase. Everybody ready? And I'm going to pull up chat so I can see some of it. 1, 2, 3, waterfall. Hit send. Oh my goodness. Oh, these names. Oh my goodness, you guys. I'm so happy at these names that I'm seeing. Oh my goodness.
To read the names out loud so that our interpreters can translate and share with on our screen reading folks.
That would be wonderful. Do you want me to do it, or
either way, you take the lead, whatever is easiest for you.
I'll start. Bria Pearson, Lalitha Marshall, Dolores Huerta, Tarana Burke, Lynette Gentiles, Reverend Dr. Selena Carter, Alicia, Cece, Kalitha, Chandra, Rosa, Felicia, Shiriel, Becky Uta Masaki, Gloria Enzaldua, Jacqueline Miller. Oh, this is so great. Shirley Chisholm, Karen Cooper. Tarana Burke gets another shout out. Lisa Calderon in Denver. Belinda Jackson, Janet K. Maya Angelou, Beth Ritchie, Diana Mansera, Hema Sarang, Sieminsky, Toni Morrison, Cynthia Rajiev, Amita Swadhin, Natasha G. Marian Kaba. Oh my gosh, this is so fabulous. She who escaped Mississippi, goddamn, and came to New York, met my dad and gave birth to me, earned her SW degrees while raising me and my sisters, and worked on behalf of survivors in a correctional facility, E. Teresa McNair. Thank you, Kim. It's beautiful. Kindness, Michelle Osborne, thank you for that. Tamike Jones, Dr. LaDonna Butler, Angelica R., new coworker Joyce Tofty, who is changing the vibration of our organization, the latest of many who inspire me. Santana DeBerry, Renown, Dorothy Roberts, Michelle Alexander, personal Dr. Teju Adegoke. Dr. Lawana Richmond, my best friend, Nick, that's a great shout out. My co-workers, Graciela, wonderful. My abuela, thank you, Anna. Our shelter manager of 20 plus years from Meredith. Our SART director from Sydney. Arlene Vassell from Casey. Kim, E. Teresa McNair. Alice Walker, Shirley Chisholm, Toni Morrison, Dr. Margaret King, Dr. Gail Frazier, Bernita Walker, Mary McLeod Bethune, historic, Arlene Vassell, Patty Branco, Jacqueline Miller, Adrienne Marie Brown. Yes, Arlene from Rebecca. Elon Omar. And I think you can help me if there are any more names, but wow. Thank you, you all, for putting those names into our space. Those names and so many others, so brilliant in their leadership, whether local, national, international, historic, or learning, we learn about them in the present day. This is the hope that I'm offering you after everything else I've been saying that may seem like, oh my God, because the hope is what continues to compel our passion and move us forward. We can't not keep moving forward in our movement, but we also can't keep perpetuating the harm that we've been doing. I'm going to end here with that idea that if y'all have questions, I think there's a way, to get in touch with me through my email, through texting me, or through LinkedIn. And I think what's important for you to know is that I want to be a support to folks. If you need to talk to me, it's never about the money. That is not never where I start. It is about how can I support you and how can I help you, because I know you're already supporting others, and that's part of what is taking a toll on you. But the other part that's taking a toll, I really want to affirm this for folks of color, for my Black brothers and sisters. The other thing that's taking a toll is the daily grind of racism and disappointment in our movement. We need to end that. And I again say, we have the power to do it. When I say we, I'm saying white folks in conjunction with us, we have the power to do it. Thank you. I've really appreciated this opportunity, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle, for that powerful presentation and activity. At this time, I want us to pause, breathe, and reflect on Michelle's presentation. I remind you to take care of yourself as we process what we've heard in this session. Again, if you need a moment to breathe, remember that the wellness room is available to you. We will now transition to open space to process what you heard. Please use the next 10 minutes to identify what you feel is the call to action and document at least one concrete action you will take in response to that call.
Thank you, Lalitha, and thank you, Michelle. This is Casey chiming in again with a note for my white cousins. If you are feeling the need to step away, I invite you to resist. Your discomfort or reluctance is always a sign that it's time to lean in and do the work. We are sharing a link in the chat to a Padlet to facilitate your sharing that you can see on the screen here. Inside, you can view the amazing illustration that Andre Medina created for us. It's a reminder about what Michelle shared with us today. We invite you to add your concrete action steps to this Padlet so others can see what you are committed to doing moving forward. How will you help to shift power? We welcome you to unmute yourself in this space to share your thoughts. And Brecken, if there's anything you'd like to lift up in the chat to help advance this processing conversation, I invite you to do so.
Sure, thanks, Casey. There was just so much gratitude for Michelle's presentation. And I do want to lift up Cecile's comment after the waterfall activity saying, thank you for reminding us how many women we admire out there. We must celebrate them more. Please send a list of these women so we can look them up. Yeah, thank you so much for encouraging us to celebrate the amazing leaders that we know, both personally and those who we don't know personally but admire from afar.
As a reminder, to add to the Padlet, simply go to the link that Brecken shared in the chat, click on the plus sign in the bottom right corner of your screen, and that will allow you to post. I can lift up, somebody says we need to hire Audre Lordes, not just quote them. Somebody says, continue to work on ridding myself of the lies I've internalized about myself and help my co-laborers, co-organizers, family, and friends to do the same. Somebody says, I commit to ongoingly grow myself to be an aspiring ally to BIPOC. I will read, reflect, learn, and lean into difficult conversations. Another, I plan to bring this information and questions back to my agency's equity committee to help determine our action steps. I challenge you to share an action step of your own personally that you're committed to today. Somebody says, every week I would like to set aside some time to reflect on the ways I uphold racism and anti-Blackness. If anyone would like to unmute, we have a couple more minutes of processing time and would invite you to do so.
This is Cecile.
Yeah, please go ahead, Cecile.
I can just say that I am so moved by all that she had to offer and shared, and so many things that I need to think about as I synthesize it into my own way of being and the work I do. This whole conference that you've had is so empowering, so reflective, has given me so much opportunity to go deeper within myself, and so relevant, you know, at this time. We live in a country where George Floyd was murdered, And for a few moments, as she said, you know, people became a little bit more conscious. But then they have amnesia and they go back to their same old ways. So it's like, yes, now we must be much more clearer in helping others to break their patterns of returning to the easy way, you know? So I'm still in reflection mode. I'm going to be in reflection mode for a few days. It's been so overwhelming, but in such a positive way. So I want to thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. You are not alone in reflection mode, I can assure you. Okay, I would like to pass the floor back to Lalitha Marshall.